All right, we're going to be talking now about psychology as a science. It's going to be the first lecture about psychology for an intro to psychology course. Psychology as a science, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk basically about a couple of things. Why we use intuition, and why we should not be using intuition, and why intuition is not really a good reason for understanding. We all look around and try to understand, in a sense, we're all scientists. You look and something happens in your life, or something happens in somebody else's life. Your friend breaks up with after wonderful relationship. Why did that happen? A person went and got caught doing some terrible deed. The politician was caught fooling around with some intern, right? Why does he do? We try to understand and make reasons to understand, but you're normally not enough. We come to conclusions and we haven't really looked through the basic data. We usually use our intuition, but it's not really a good enough reason to understand all of what's happening. We need good objective data. We have to also understand the difference between values and facts, and why we need facts to understand the way the relationships work within the world. The basic idea of science is to understand relationships between two things in the natural world. It's not enough to use. Sometimes, for instance, we believe that global warming is bad. Is that a fact? Well, I don't know. We think that it's bad that certain lakes are drying up or getting polluted. Why is that happening? Is it because of, well, we might come to certain sort of reasonings, and why do we need these facts in order to come to a deeper understanding of the way things work in the world? Of course, this isn't true. This is true with all of the sciences. It's certainly true also with psychology, where intuition tends to be a lot more prevalent and more easy to fall back on. The idea of psychology working on with science, you think, well, okay, there are a lot of different types of psychologists, and we're going to talk about this maybe in one of the upcoming lectures of different types of psychologists. But basically, there are two basic types of psychologists: there's research psychologists, and there are clinical psychologists. Of course, the research psychologists are looking to understand the behavior of people, and they do tests and experiments, and all sounds very, very scientific. And of course, you have to use a scientific method to create new knowledge and to understand why this thing and that thing, how people react to a different color. Or most people will have a calming effect to a color, or not a calming effect to a color. Does music affect people? Can we learn a new language with me? For instance, do singing songs help learn a language? Well, you might think it would be, but you have to do tests and use a scientific method to understand that actually, and there has been research to show that if you learn learning a new language, and you learn it by using songs, it'll actually help you learn it. Now, why does that happen? Well, we'd have to make some hypotheses and go through the scientific method. There'll be a separate lecture on the scientific method, which is a good idea, by the way, that everybody should go and learn what it means, a scientific method. But what about the other basic area of psychologists, which are the practitioners, those people who are going to help us in counseling, etc., school psychologists, the guy on the couch, right, the psychoanalyst we're going to, or any other type of a psychologist. They still need to use a scientific method, either using the research or by using that method of of trying to understand how things work, even when they are doing a session. They're still asking what are the questions and hypotheses which they're going to use in order to understand deeper into this intrapsychic and the workings of an individual's mind. So it's the idea of scientific method is important for research, for practitioners, for counselors, for all different types of psychologists. It's important to use scientific method, to use data and hypotheses and checking and experimental ways of thought in order to understand on a deeper level what the relationships are between one factor and another. Okay, so what is the problem with intuition? Of course, the problem with intuition is because we think that we know something, and then we're going to feel that it's going to be true. But we are often fooled by our perceptions. What we think is right might be wrong, because if something seems right, we feel comfortable, and that's number one. We have all sorts of reasons to change our perceptions. We will see in the course of even Intro to Psychology and further on, if you go further on in psychology or any of the human services, we find that the human brain is extremely flexible in the way it understands things. And we can come to bad conclusions simply because we have our particular set of understanding how to get things done. And when you have a particular way of doing things, you might do things in the wrong way or understand things in the wrong way. If you have an aggressive behavior, why is that happening? Okay, why was that happening? So we tend to think that we know what's going on, but we don't necessarily. One of the problems we have is called hindsight bias. What is this hindsight bias? What does that mean? It means that after we see something and we have an explanation, we say, oh, I knew that all along. I once had a professor that said all of social science is the exploration to understand something which you actually knew all along. Well, that's not exactly true. It's that we think that we could have predicted it. Once we see the prediction, we see the relationship. Oh, I could have figured that one out. I knew that all along. No, it doesn't really work that way. People do that. It's called hindsight bias. As looking backwards, when you look backwards, you say, oh, now I understand. But looking forwards, you might not have come up to that same conclusion. Because looking backwards, you're looking back through a different lens than when you're looking forward. It can go at many different ways. That is one problem. The other problem which we might have is that, well, we'll get to that. Avoid this hindsight bias. We use the empirical methods. Empirical means that is measurable, and we can understand things that can be replicated. In other words, what we do is we organize and collect and make experiments in order according to what we see the possible relationships. This is the whole idea of the scientific method. Again, I will do a separate lecture explaining the scientific method and how it's used and how it's misused. I'll do that in the future, God willing. But it is a specific set, of assumptions, rules, procedures that we do in order to have empirical research. Empirical research which is objective, and research which can be replicated. So why are these important? Well, one reason is because we have to, with empirical methods, we can differentiate between the ideas of facts and values. Sometimes we get actually confused between facts and values. And this is I found in my years of teaching undergraduate students. I think this is an important concept to acquire during the undergraduate years. Often because in high schools, people are taught to express their values and to become in touch with their values as part of the developmental stage of adolescence, is to incorporate values into your personality, as we'll see in psychology. But when you get to college, you're starting to be able to differentiate between facts and values. So, for instance, one might say students should wear school uniforms. Now, that is a value. Is it true in all cases that students should wear school uniforms? Well, it's true that if there's a rule then students should be wear school uniforms, otherwise they might get into trouble. But that is not a fact that students should wear school uniforms across the board. Not even in every school. And it's not even a fact that it's necessarily going to help the education in some level or not. It could be verifiable and turn into a fact. But right now, that's just a value, okay? And in other words, because you say, I believe, if you can change should wear to say that I believe that, then it must be a value. I believe that students should wear school uniforms, right? As against a simple objective fact, for instance, 16,000 homicides in the U.S. in 2009, that's indisputable. You might want to make a question on that to find out further facts, right? Did these 16,000 homicides happen in urban or rural areas, and what percentage? Do these percentage changes over the course of the years? Were the homicides done with guns or with ropes or with et cetera, et cetera? You can ask more questions. But the fact is, and that you can't argue, okay? Generally speaking, that with a fact that's verifiable, and with a value, it's something which can change according to a particular circumstance. Let's just look at this a little bit further so you can get this idea really get down into your head. When we talk about values, right, we can say handguns should be forbidden. They should be outlawed, right? Is that necessarily true, right? Should we? Well, that's debatable. Some people say yes, some people will say no. So that's obviously a value, okay? But it certainly sounds pretty reasonable. Is it? I'm not so sure. Okay, let's go further. Let's say smoking is really a bad idea, right? So quitting smoking is important. That sounds almost like a fact, does it? Well, not necessarily. It's still, because we're calling it important, it's called the value. How do we change these things, these values, into facts? What is the comparable fact which comes out of these statements of value? Let's sort of say, for instance, handguns should be outlawed. We can say that in the year 2010, 30,000 deaths were caused by handguns. That's a fact. Or at least we're stating that as a statement of fact. Now, we can deduce from that a value that handguns should be outlawed. Now, that doesn't necessarily follow. For instance, we could use the fact that 30,000 deaths were caused by handguns. Let's say we went and delve deeper into that fact and say, what was it about those handguns that caused, or the situations that caused the deaths? Let's say, for instance, we found out that 29,000 of those deaths were caused by malfunctioning handguns. Then you wouldn't say handguns would be, and it's not true as far as I know. Then you wouldn't say that handguns should be outlawed because of that fact. You'd say that we need better controls on the manufacturing of handguns, so we would avoid the deaths by handguns. Possible. But the point is that the values are shaped by the facts in this case. So here, how we change the idea of smoking? We say smoking increases the incidence of cancer. So if it increases the incidence of cancer, then quitting smoking is important. Now, even here, let's say you would find that smoking increases the incidence of cancer, or the likelihood of getting cancer, as long as you don't have a particular gene, for instance. Now, I'm just making this up, but let's say there's a gene that protects you from cancer. If you have this gene, smoking is never going to kill, or 99% sure it will not kill you, or whatever. So if nobody around you has to worry about secondhand smoke, right, then you might say smoking will not increase the incidence of cancer. In that particular situation, that might be a fact. In which case, for that particular person, quitting smoking isn't that important. It might be nice, it might be good, but it's not that important. If that were true, okay? In other words, if you were delved down deeper into the facts, you might actually find that the values change, even though they seem to be very close together. Now, this happens in this give and play between facts and values and facts. They work together on a regular basis. For instance, We know that facts can shape the values. I just showed you that, right? Now, what about the values determining what facts we're going to look for? You see here a picture of this little boy hitting a Bobo doll. This is a very famous experiment by Albert Bandura from Stanford University, which you will be seeing the video during this course. And what Bandura was looking for was how observing an adult acting aggressively towards a doll would increase the incidence of aggression by children who observed that adult. Very famous, a very famous experiment. He was interested, his values were peacefulness. His values were anti-aggression. His values were, or his thoughts were, that, you know what, it's not a good idea that children are watching so much violence and aggression on television. So because he had those values, he looked for particular experimental facts. And he set up an experiment in where children were going to look at aggression and see if the observing of aggression were going to influence the amount and type of aggression that children would be displaying. Of course, he did find that, and we'll talk about that when we get to the section on learning. And the end of that section, we'll talk about observational learning. So that is the idea of what we get the difference between facts and values. But once we start looking and experimenting and asking questions in psychology, we have to understand that there are different levels that we might talk about in psychology itself. And it's important to understand that these things are very different. Although they are extremely, again, well-bound and well-connected and well-interplaying with each other. The interconnections, interreactions are extremely tight and complex and usually not very well understood. There's basically three different levels, okay? There's the cultural, social, all-encompassing type of level that we could talk about. There's the interpersonal between two people. And there's the genetic or the biological or the neurological type of explanation. All these things are always present in every single psychological question. We don't always look at all of this. We sometimes we're not up to that in the progress of science, but they are always all there. So, for instance, here we have this example of depression. The common cold of psychopathology, right, of mental illness. So there are a lot of influences that we can talk about that helps people to become depressed or prevents them from being undepressed, etc., etc. We can certainly talk at the most basic, smallest, micro-precisional sort of thing, the questions of genetic factors, genetic things, and that can cause genes that can cause depression. Is it true that some people have a genetic disposition to become depressed? Well, it's something that has to be asked, and something that has to be hypothesized, something that has to be explored scientifically. Also, as we're going to see many times, that there's also a question of the brain chemistry. Anybody who's had any experience with depression will say they'll talk about brain chemistry in this case. But it is, in other words, there are certain neurotransmitters, certain chemical messengers that go in the brain which influence depression, either make it more likely, make it less likely. That's all on the very, very microscopic type of level. That's not the whole story, though. Even though there's some biological psychologists who might want you to think that way, but it's not. And therefore, also, by the way, the implication is that it's not the whole story. You can't always give medicines to change the depression because not the whole story. There's also interpersonal questions. There's what we might call the more psychological things. Is there a relationship which pushes us to be more depressed? Right? Is there a way we cope with depression? Is there something, the way we think, that is going to influence depression, that we're going to see? That it's very common that all those things are very well explored and a level of explanation in psychology. Now, if you're going to talk about an interpersonal type of thing, this relationship is making me depressed. This relationship is pushing me over the brink, right? You're talking only on that level. Does that mean that there is no neurological or chemical influences? Of course there are, okay? But that you might not necessarily talk about that interplay, but we know that there is. So it's a different level of explanation, okay? And then you go further in the culture and the social influences on this case, depression, right? Women are more likely to be depressed than men. Why? Why is it like that? Well, there could be social and cultural influences. Women are more likely to express depression, where men, even if they get the same interpersonal and biological factors, they might actually tend to become more aggressive rather than the person become anxious and aggressive. And they would come out with a different diagnosis, and they wouldn't be called themselves depressed. So there's different levels. And it doesn't mean that anything that if you look at it in one level, it doesn't mean the other levels are not there. Or not important. They are all important, but in order to facilitate understanding, we have to define on what level we're talking about. So these are all very important ways of doing. Okay, but so why is it, since we've taken this all apart, right, and we can talk about facts and we can talk about the level of the facts, it's still a challenge to talk about psychology. And one of the reasons, because there's individual differences on all the psychological dimensions, right? Not everybody is exactly the same if you talk about intelligence, creativity, aggression, ability to do math. People are different on any of the psychological depressions. Why might somebody go through the completely same situation, the same idea, even the same genetics, one becomes depressed and one doesn't? That's one of the things we have to find out now, that because there are, with many, many different factors coming in, you still come up with a different conclusion. So that's a real challenge. And that is because certainly many of these things, any particular one behavior can be produced by many different factors which bring that into account. We don't know all of the factors, and we can't control for all the factors. One of the challenges of studying psychology is to be able to make an experiment where we are going to be able to control as many possible ideas or factors or influences on a behavior in order to see how one of those one factor will make something more or less likely. And a third thing is that most of the causes of behavior are outside our conscious awareness. We do not know everything that influences a particular behavior. There's a lot of stuff in the brain which we can't possibly understand. We're not even close to understanding the things that happen inside our brain. And a matter of fact, we will see that there are many theories and understandings in psychology which are based on the idea that there's so much going on outside of our awareness. We have, and that has to do a lot with the way we're taught to perceive things. It becomes extremely difficult. I mean, we talk about psychology, clinical psychology. Sigmund Freud, which we're going to see in another lecture, based his whole idea of human personality and development that everything was in the subconscious. There are schools of psychology that said that we shouldn't even be discussing the subconscious, but it becomes very difficult for us to understand why that happens. No matter how deep you look at something, it's going to be very difficult to understand. We're going to see also how the importance of the subconscious mind in determining and understanding everything we see and perceive, even more than what we behave, the way we behave. So this is basically the first ideas of what we need to think about when we're talking about studying psychology in general. From here, we're going to go on to little more specifics in the history of psychology and the types of psychology, and I'll see you next time.